Yes, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the Singapore International Cyber Week 2023. My name is Charlene, pleased to be MC for this afternoon. I do see a lot of friends as well as associates and also partners coming from all around the globe. First and foremost, please give yourself as well as people around you a big round of applause. Welcome to Singapore. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this afternoon, we have an exciting lineup of panelists, and we would like to share with you insights as well as perspectives into the theme of ransomware exposed, insights into operations and safeguarding techniques. So I'd also like to encourage all of you to start posing your questions for the discussion through Slido. So you may like to do so by scanning the QR code. So this will help us during the Q&A segment. All right, next, ladies and gentlemen, we just want to share with you some information. Ransomware threat actors are increasingly employing extortion techniques to gain leverage over targeted organizations. So organizations need to evolve their defenses and also ransomware operation to address the various methods used by threat actors to apply pressure. Ransomware operation today must also address the need to safeguard organizations' reputation and also consider how to protect employees as well as customers who may become targets of such tactics. So our panelists today will share with us their insights as well as experience of conducting ransomware operation, so you could also protect yourself from such attacks. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like you to welcome our next speaker. Now, he will be delivering the keynote speech in Bahasa Indonesian. We will have a translator on site. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Hinsa Siburian, Head of National Cyber and Crypto Agency of Indonesia. Today, he's going to share with us ransomware operations.
Selamat sore dan salam sejahtera kepada panelis, moderator terhormat serta para delegasi yang berbahagia.
Good afternoon, distinguished panelists and moderators and esteemed delegates.
Merupakan sebuah kehormatan bagi kami pada sore hari ini dapat menyampaikan keynote speech dalam sesi panel tingkat tinggi Singapore International Cyber Week tentang mengungkap ransomware, wawasan tentang operasi dan teknis pelindungan.
It is an absolute honor for me this afternoon to deliver a keynote speech in the high-level panel session in the 8th Singapore International Cyber Week on ransomware exposed, insight into operation and safeguarding techniques.
Bapak dan Ibu hadirin yang berbahagia, ancaman siber merupakan keinginan dan kemampuan pihak tertentu baik aktor perseorangan maupun kelompok kriminal yang didukung atau disponsori oleh negara, state actor maupun non-state actor yang mempunyai potensi dan kemampuan untuk bermanifestasi dalam serangan di atau dari ruang siber.
Distinguished delegates, cyber threats are the intention and capabilities of certain parties, both individual actors and criminal groups supported or sponsored by state actors and non-state actors, which have the potential and possibility to manifest in attacks in or from cyberspace.
Serangan siber adalah upaya aktif dan kemampuan pihak tertentu dengan tujuan untuk merusak dan menimbulkan kerugian pada target serangan. Serangan cyber memiliki dua sifat, yaitu serangan siber bersifat teknis dan serangan bersifat sosial.
A cyber attack is an active effort and ability of a particular party with the aim of disrupting and causing harm to the target of the attack. According to its nature, there are two types of cyber attacks, namely the technical cyber attacks and social cyber attacks.
Serangan siber bersifat teknis menyerang jaringan logika melalui metode-metode teknis intrusif dengan tujuan mendapatkan akses ilegal ke dalam jaringan dan sistem ruang siber pihak sasaran guna menghancurkan, mengubah, mencuri, atau memasukkan informasi.
Technical cyber attacks target logical networks through intrusive technical methods with the aim of acquiring illegal access into the target's networks and systems in order to destroy, modify, steal, and/or add information.
Sedangkan serangan siber bersifat sosial menargetkan ide, pilihan, pendapat, emosi, tingkah laku, opini, dan atau motivasi manusia untuk mempengaruhi cara berpikir, sistem kepercayaan, dan sikap tindak dari manusia yang berinteraksi di ruang siber.
And meanwhile, social cyber attacks target humans' ideas, choices, emotions, behaviors, opinions, and or motivations to influence their thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes as they interact in the cyberspace.
Salah satu serangan siber bersifat teknis adalah malicious software, malware, yang merupakan perangkat lunak yang dirancang oleh para pelaku kejahatan siber guna merusak atau mengeksploitasi perangkat, sistem, atau jaringan.
Among the technical cyber attacks is malware, which is a software designed by cyber criminals to damage or exploit devices, systems, or networks.
Salah satu jenis malware yang memiliki dampak paling besar saat ini adalah ransomware. Ransomware digunakan untuk mencuri dan menyandra data dengan cara mengenkripsi, kemudian meminta tebusan kepada korban.
And one type of malware that has the greatest impact is ransomware, which aims to steal and encrypt files as well as extort a payment from the victims.
Pelaku kejahatan ransomware meminta uang tebusan dalam jumlah yang bervariasi, mulai dari puluhan, ratusan, bahkan jutaan dolar. Korban yang membayar uang tebusan tidak menjamin mendapat kerugian yang lebih kecil dibanding dengan tidak membayar tebusan, karena korban tetap harus mengeluarkan biaya pemulihan sistem yang telah diserang.
Ransomware criminals demand varying amounts of ransoms ranging from tens, hundreds, to even millions of dollars. In fact, paying for ransomware does not guarantee any cost savings compared to not paying for it because the victim still needs to pay the cost of restoring the attack systems.
Infrastruktur informasi vital, khususnya pada sektor teknologi informasi dan komunikasi, dan sektor keuangan merupakan sektor yang terbesar menjadi sasaran dari serangan ransomware.
CII sector is continuously becoming the biggest target of attacks, with the information and communication technology sector and the financial sector being the most targeted sectors.
Bapak dan Ibu hadirin sekalian, Badan Siber dan Sandi Negara Republik Indonesia melalui Pusat Operasi Keamanan Siber Nasional telah mencatat lebih dari 900.000 serangan ransomware pada tahun 2022 di Indonesia, sedangkan pada periode 1 Januari sampai dengan 17 Oktober 2023, kami telah mencatat adanya lebih dari 879.000 serangan ransomware.
Ladies and gentlemen, the National Cyber and Crypto Agency of Indonesia, through its National Cybersecurity Operations Center, has recorded more than 900,000 ransomware attacks in 2022 in Indonesia. Meanwhile, since the 1st of January this year until today, we have recorded more than 879,000 ransomware attacks.
Dengan demikian, terdapat potensi peningkatan serangan ransomware di Indonesia pada tahun 2023 dibandingkan tahun 2022. 3 jenis ransomware yang paling banyak ditemukan di Indonesia yaitu Lockbit 3.0, Lunamon, dan WannaCry.
And these numbers clearly show a potential increase in ransomware attacks in Indonesia in 2023 compared to 2022. And the 3 most common ransomware identified in the attacks are Lockbit 3.0, Lunamon, and WannaCry.
Serangan ransomware menimbulkan dampak negatif diantaranya terganggunya layanan, terhambatnya proses bisnis, kerugian finansial, dan juga menurunnya kepercayaan dari para pelanggan atau pengguna layanan.
Ransomware attacks certainly pose negative impacts, including disruption of services, disruption of business processes, financial losses, and also decreased trust from customers or service users.
Serangan ransomware terhadap infrastruktur informasi vital tentu dapat mengganggu roda perekonomian, khususnya rantai pasok, supply chain, serta stabilitas keamanan nasional.
Ransomware attacks against the CII sector can certainly disrupt the economy, especially the supply chain, and thus the stability of national security.
Merujuk analisa dari Know Before, pada tahun 2021 tercatat kerugian global yang disebabkan oleh ransomware yaitu sebesar 20 miliar dolar Amerika. Angka ini diprediksi akan mencapai nilai 265 miliar dolar Amerika pada tahun 2031 apabila ransomware tidak ditangani dengan serius.
Referring to the analysis of KnowBe4 in 2021, global losses due to ransomware were recorded at $20 billion, and this number is predicted to reach $265 billion by 2031 if ransomware is not seriously contained.
Dalam analisis tersebut juga disebutkan bahwa 74% aspek kelemahan manusia menjadi faktor penyebab serangan ransomware di tahun 2022. Oleh karena itu, pengetahuan dan kesadaran kita terhadap bahaya serangan ransomware harus selalu ditingkatkan.
The analysis also stated that human aspect accounts for 74% of the attacks in 2022. Therefore, we need to keep updating our knowledge and increasing our awareness of the existing threats.
Hadirin yang saya hormati, sebagai upaya mengantisipasi dan mengatasi serangan ransomware, Badan Siber dan Sandi Negara Republik Indonesia melakukan beberapa inisiatif operasi.
In an effort to anticipate and mitigate ransomware attacks, the National Cyber and Crypto Agency of Indonesia has carried out several operational initiatives.
Yang pertama, melakukan monitoring 24 jam terhadap anomali traffic melalui sensor keamanan siber dan Honeynet untuk memberikan notifikasi secara proaktif kepada setiap pemangku kepentingan yang berpotensi terkena serangan ransomware.
First, we monitor traffic anomalies 24/7 by means of sensors including Honeynets to proactively provide notifications to any stakeholders potentially affected by the ransomware attack.
Kedua, melakukan analisis terhadap jenis ransomware yang menginfeksi sistem milik pemangku kepentingan di Indonesia.
And second, we conduct analysis of various types of ransomwares infecting the systems of our stakeholders in Indonesia.
Ketiga, mengembangkan teknik deteksi ransomware menggunakan pasi hash dalam rangka optimalisasi kemampuan deteksi ransomware di Indonesia dan mengembangkan teknik pencegahan untuk menghalangi proses enkripsi data oleh serangan ransomware.
So we develop a ransomware detection technique using fuzzy hash to optimize our ransomware detection capabilities in Indonesia and develop prevention technique to block data encryption process by ransomware.
Selanjutnya, melaksanakan asistensi penanganan kasus ransomware yang berkolaborasi dengan Kepolisian Republik Indonesia dan instansi penegak hukum lainnya.
And finally, we assist our stakeholders in handling ransomware cases in collaboration with the police and other law enforcement.
Bapak Ibu hadirin yang berbahagia, sebagaimana kita ketahui dalam rangka membangun keamanan siber nasional sangat tergantung dari tiga aspek yang saling terkait dan mendukung satu sama lain, yaitu people, proses, dan teknologi.
Distinguished delegates, as we all know, the development of national cybersecurity is very dependent on three aspects that are interrelated, namely the people, process, and technology.
Aspek people berkaitan dengan perencanaan penyusunan kebutuhan standar, serta peningkatan kapasitas dan kapabilitas sumber daya manusia keamanan siber.
First, the people aspect is related to the planning for standard requirements as well as the development of the capacity and capability of cybersecurity human resources.
Aspek proses berkaitan dengan penyusunan berbagai regulasi dan tata kelola keamanan siber.
Second, the process aspect is related to the preparation of various cybersecurity regulations and governance.
Aspek teknologi berkaitan dengan teknologi dan infrastruktur yang relevan dengan keamanan siber.
And the technological aspect is related to the technology and infrastructure related to cybersecurity.
Dalam rangka menghadapi ancaman ransomware di wilayah kawasan Asia Tenggara perlu dilakukan kolaborasi dan sinergi antar negara dalam bingkai kerjasama ASEAN.
In the framework of operational and technical protection against cyber attack, collaboration and synergy between countries is much needed for cybersecurity, especially in Southeast Asia region.
Upaya operasional dan teknis pelindungan dari serangan ransomware kami menyarankan antara lain.
And for operational effort, we recommend the following things.
Satu, mengembangkan implementasi ASEAN Computer Emergency Response Team atau ASEAN CERT sebagai wadah untuk negara-negara kawasan ASEAN antara lain.
First, developing the implementation of ASEAN Computer Emergency Response Team or ASEAN CERT as a forum for ASEAN member states to face ransomware attacks, including through
pertukaran informasi melalui pemberian notifikasi, koordinasi secara berkesinambungan, dan memperkuat mekanisme penanganan insiden siber khususnya serangan ransomware di kawasan regional ASEAN.
exchange of information through providing notification, continuous coordination, and strengthening mechanism for handling cyber incidents, especially ransomware attacks in the ASEAN region.
Peningkatan kapabilitas sumber daya manusia keamanan siber melalui kerjasama di bidang pelatihan keamanan siber antar negara ASEAN.
Development of cybersecurity human resource capabilities through cooperation in the field of cybersecurity training between countries.
Mengembangkan platform information sharing lintas negara dalam rangka meningkatkan kesadaran situasional, baik di level nasional maupun regional, terhadap serangan ransomware, termasuk varian serangan baru yang berkembang akibat didorong oleh adanya artificial intelligence.
Development of a cross-border information sharing platform in order to increase situational awareness both at the national and regional levels against ransomware attacks, including new variants developing as a result of being driven by artificial intelligence.
Kedua, membangun rencana kontingensi jika terjadi krisis siber di salah satu negara anggota kawasan ASEAN dan menyelenggarakan latihan gabungan joint exercise antar CERT di wilayah ASEAN seperti yang telah dilaksanakan di beberapa negara kawasan regional lainnya.
And secondly, developing a contingency plan in the event that a cyber crisis occurs in one of the ASEAN member states and organize joint exercises between CERT in the ASEAN region as has been implemented in other regions.
Hadirin sekalian, melalui forum Singapore International Cyber Week tahun 2023 ini, Indonesia mengajak semua delegasi perwakilan negara yang hadir untuk dapat mendiskusikan dan merumuskan bagaimana kita menghadapi serangan ransomware khususnya di kawasan regional ASEAN.
Distinguished delegates, in the 8th Singapore International Cyber Week 2023 today, Indonesia invites all delegates of country representatives attending this event to discuss and formulate steps on mitigating ransomware attacks, especially in the ASEAN region.
Demikian sambutan saya, selamat sore dan terima kasih.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hitsan Hiburian. Thank you for sharing this, your keynote address. And ladies and gentlemen, while we're waiting for the stage to be set, let me just share with you some background about the Singapore International Cyber Week. So this is organized by the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, CSA. Now, this is the Singapore International Cyber Week. This is also the Asia Pacific's most established cybersecurity event. Now, CSA is Singapore's national authority for cybersecurity, and it plays a pivotal role in Singapore's smart nation and digital economy ambition. So, into its 8th edition of the SICW, this takes place yesterday all the way to the 19th October. So, it's held at Sands Expo and Convention Center. And the theme is Building Trust and Security in the Emerging Digital Order. So we will explore the impact of digital developments on the global multilateral order. And next up, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to share with you, we would like to dive deeper into the panel discussion right now. And with that, our panelists for this afternoon, they've been here really early, at least an hour earlier. So please put your hands together for our panelists. And they are Air Vice Marshal Aman Chamtri. Let us give him a big round of applause for Secretary General, National Cybersecurity Agency, Thailand. And we also have with us Mr. Stephen Kavanagh, Executive Director, Interpol. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for Mr. Shane Huntley, Chief Privacy, Safety, Security Officer for APAC, Senior Director of Threat Analysis Group, Google. Let's give him a big hand. Next panelist, let's put our hands together for Mr. Philip Reiner, Chief Executive Officer, Institute for Security and Technology. Last but not least, let's put our hands together for Mr. Scott Morgan, Senior Vice President, Chief Legal Officer, Global Affairs and Security of Splunk Inc. And our moderator for this afternoon, Mr. Charles Ng, Executive Vice President, International Business of Ensign Info Security. Let's give them all a big round of applause. Wow, star-studded cast for this afternoon. So this heavyweight high-level panel is about to begin. I'd like to hand the mic over to Charles. Charles.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming today. I think for many of us in the cyber world, ransomware actually is totally not new, right? For some of us who have been here at least 10 years, we knew that this was coming. When ransomware exploded in the past 3-4 years, it was wildly successful as an approach to achieve whatever the attacker wanted to achieve. And so I think today we have a very established panel, and we're going to discuss this a bit more. There are a few key areas we want to sort of delve into. The first thing is, what is the landscape today for ransomware? Has anything really changed? Right? That's the first question. The second question is really from a national, international, and down to the enterprise level. Are there sort of best practices from a policy, technology, best practices across the board, processes, etc., that we can look into? And then thirdly, how do we go from here? Right? How do we really go from here to resolve this problem? Is this problem really resolvable, right? So to begin, I've asked the panelists to at least begin in the first 3 minutes to just introduce themselves and then to share some insights. Subsequently, we will move to some, I'll have a couple of questions for all of them. And then we'll have the questions from the audience, and then we'll see how that goes, okay? Can I begin with you, Shane? If you might just introduce yourself and share some insights.
Thank you very much. So, my name's Shane Huntley, and amongst other things, I lead Google's threat analysis group, which is the group that looks at serious threats to Google and our users. And we split that up into a number of different areas, whether it's exploits, state-sponsored threats, information operations. But what we're talking about today is also the cybercrime threats. And we started off just doing the government-backed threats like 13 years ago, but then it rapidly became apparent that these threats from cyber criminals, especially ransomware, were just as big a threat, if not a bigger threat to users than the state-sponsored threats. So we treat it the same way. We actually track the threat actors, we counter the threat actors, and we look at them. So I have this great team spread around the globe that looks at all of these threats, and I just wanted to start with like a couple of insights of what we've seen over sort of the recent times of how this has evolved. I think, so everyone sort of like saw the heyday of this a number of years ago, where there was like the standard ransomware operation of they got in, they broke into something like a hospital, they encrypted all the data or went into some sort of corporate environment, encrypted the data, and demanded Bitcoin in response for some decryption key. And that was it was incredibly effective, right? They were going after the weak link of organizations that never really had to worry about espionage before, but suddenly, they really did need to have that availability of their systems, so they were able to be ransomed for that information. And the systems were running on legacy systems, on Active Directory, shares open everywhere, no good backups, and they were able to have a lot of effect. Over the last couple of years, we've seen some evolution, and part of that's because we're all getting better at this, and you all are getting better at this, that those attacks aren't working quite as well for many actors. So they're moving on to different techniques. So on the actual technique side, we're seeing they're having to use greater number of exploits. We're starting to see zero-day exploits. We're also seeing more professionalization and sort of, more involvement of initial access brokers and different people providing different parts of it. We're also seeing the business model change. Instead of encrypting everything and just asking for the key, we're moving to they exfiltrate the data, which is somewhat easier, and then running extortion. So I think extortion is the big growth compared to the encryption. Not saying the old threats have gone away, but there's these new models, and this is the constant adaptation of attackers that we see everywhere, that as the sort of defenses on one front come, the attackers will adapt. I think the other, we quickly can answer questions later, is the other adaptation is happening on the actual attacker side, that the ecosystem is changing. And like one of the big effects that my team talked about through our big fog of war report talking about the Ukraine war is that there was a big upheaval in this world of prior to the invasion of Ukraine, there were Ukrainian and Russian sort of ransomware operators all working together, and they suddenly weren't friends anymore after this invasion, so there was a lot of upheaval between the groups. We also saw some movement of the ransomware groups in Russia now targeting Ukraine, and the lines blurring between these state-sponsored and sort of cybercrime missions. And this general sort of evolution and fragmentation of the space. So there's now more actors, more split, less trust, which means we're facing a much more diverse range of threats from these actors, and we need to be prepared against different lines. So I think that's the broad scope of how we're seeing that things are not the same as it was in, say, 2019 or 2020 as we go into 2023.
Interesting, Shane. I've got a quick question for you, just something to think about before we move to Philip. I mean, defenses have all gone up. Do you think it's become more expensive for the attacker to attack?
I think the rate of, I think it has become more expensive in some ways. I also think that they're not guaranteed success as much as they were. I think, I don't have the hard data, and maybe some of the other panels do, on how much money they're making out of this, but I think it has got harder for the attackers, and I think that's a good thing. So I don't think this is a lost cause. Great,
thanks. Philip, you've got an interesting sort of career, in the Obama administration. We'd love to hear some of that and some of the insights that you have.
Yeah, sure, and thank you, Charles. And I want to first and foremost say thank you to the government of Singapore for making this happen, to Mr. David Koh and the Cybersecurity Authority. I think the ability of what they do at Singapore International Cyber Week is really phenomenal. And you can see that just by looking around this room at the diversity of people that are coming together to have this conversation. So it's an honor to be here. So my name is Philip Reiner. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Security and Technology. So we are a nonprofit research institute that's based in California. And the work that we do is to really try to create venues to build bridges between technologists and national security policymakers. So what does that mean in practice, right? Everyone always talks about how technology is disrupting ecosystems and all of the rest of that. That has knock-on effects, right? That's some of the problems that we're talking about here, I think, during the course of the entire week. How do you translate that for a national security policymaker, and vice versa? That's what we do at IST, and that's what we did with the ransomware task force. So looking back, and Charles, I think this is to your question, looking back in this was almost 3 years ago now, in late 2020, at least in the American context, I mean, ransomware is not a new thing. Ransomware has been a problem for a very long time. But in the fall of 2020, it was really awful in the US. The number of hospitals that were getting hit, the number of schools that were getting hit. And we looked around and we said, well, why isn't somebody doing more about this? Why isn't there an actual coordinated campaign to destroy these people that are doing this? I have a background. I worked at the Pentagon for almost a decade. I served in the Obama White House for almost 4 years. We have incredible capabilities, but the ransomware ecosystem was thriving. And why is that possible? How is this happening? And so what we did is we took a step back and we thought about what is a comprehensive approach to actually solving the ransomware problem. And so for those who have seen the report, we issued it back in April of 2021. I apologize in advance, it's 81 pages, right? So this is 48 different recommendations in 4 pillars. This gets to some of what Shane was just talking about. Why has the ecosystem been fractured? Why has the ransomware actor had to kind of change TTPs? Well, in part, and I think, Charles, this is what you're asking about, it's because governments across the globe have really changed the way they approach this problem. Our argument back in 21 was that this is no longer, and Mr. David Koh said this morning, it's no longer a cyber threat, ransomware. It's no longer an economic nuisance. This is a national security threat. It can shut down your ports, it can close down your shipping capabilities, it can close your hospitals, and even worse, it can actually put people's lives at risk. And so what are we going to do differently about this? The United States government, by way of example, at the head of state level has stepped up and really changed the way that it approaches the ransomware problem. During the Obama administration and during the Trump administration, this was really not the level of priority that you see that it is today. In the United States now, you have the Deputy National Security Advisor who's here this week, who is leading an international effort to get after ransomware. That is unheard of a couple of years ago. To have the President of the United States speaking publicly about a ransomware threat, that was an incredible thing to see. The way that governments have been approaching this is, in part, trying to put more resources against the problem, right? Trying to actually, there are legislative steps that have been taken, but I think one of the most important pieces is that they've actually been working very closely with the private sector to try and do more collaboratively through public-private partnerships and through operational collaboration to take it to the bad guys and make it harder for these folks to take such easy advantage of what is this business model. So we can talk more about that as we go through things, but I think that's one of the fundamental changes we've seen over the last couple of years is governments are approaching this in a fundamentally different way.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, and that was very insightful. And Mr. Emin, I'd love to hear your views as well.
Okay, my name is Amon Chomchoi, but you can call me Amon. I'm from the NCSA of Thailand, the National Cyber Security Agency of Thailand. It's quite new agencies, only 2 years and 10 months now. And our focus mainly is for the Cyber Security Act. We focus on the risk-based management. Okay, basically what inside is that we just copy whatever Singapore have and just replace the name of the country. We focus on the CAI and the government agency and try to enforce the NIST cybersecurity framework and we use the latest version, which is still in draft, because we ask all the organizations to have a CISO, to have a governance body in place. Okay, includes all the identification of the possible critical service and how to provide the protection and detective measure, and also prepare to do the response, just in case there's something went wrong. Okay, but life is not easy. If we just declare the law and everything is turned out to be like what we have planned, our life would be so simple. I will be out of the job. So if we take some time to actually get all the CAI and government agencies to actually follow whatever have said in the Cyber Security Act, and we see greater improvement in terms of number of cases that reduce. Because 2 years ago, the highest sector that we have problem is public health. It's got the most case for data breach and most case for ransomware as well. And usually when your health information could possibly be leaking, that cause more of concern. But for that, we see some big change from the ministry level. Yeah. Even though we haven't invested anything, but the minister and the permanent secretary just keep asking for improvement in cybersecurity posture. They just improve it by improving the process. Even though the budget for technology is quite expensive, but if you improve the process and you got emphasis from the top level, then you can make a big change. Okay. But regarding the ransomware case, now, our concern is about the Lockbit, and reason for it because they have an affiliate program. Okay, if you run into that, you don't have money, but if you have VPN username password account, if you have the admin account for your server, you can go to Lockbit portal and share that information with them. And once they successfully attack your organization and get paid, you get half. Okay? That's the scary model, because if the insider becomes the threat, what kind of technology could you deploy to detect those kind of incidents? So for the ransomware, what we have seen it's not just about the technology. It's about how focused your executive at the top level and how you conduct the auditing in action of the administrator. That's something you need to take a look at. Okay. And also the other area of change that we have seen is that they're now using a lot of living off the land program. So instead of create a new malware that your current protection measure can detect, they just use whatever you already have. After they get initial access by using the admin credential, they can just write a program and use whatever you already have in your system to do the attack. Okay. That's another challenging in terms of technology because you cannot rely on the signature, but you have to rely on detection of behavior. What kind of traffic that the system are making. Okay. And also, one thing I just seen last week regarding the ransomware, because right now, when they ask for ransom, especially in Thailand, no one's paying for it because they haven't learned about Thai economic situation. The price they're asking is too much. Okay. No one can pay it. Not that we don't want our data to be recovered, not that we don't want to have the data breach incident, but we just don't have the money. Like for example, about 2-3 years ago, during COVID, some of the airlines got attacked and they asked for 120 million baht. It's not going to be success in terms of payment because none of the airlines are operating. So they should learn more about economic model to get better pay. But back to my point, one thing we just seen is that even though the company doesn't pay, but what the ransomware gang are doing is that they start selling private keys. Okay? So that they don't have to be the ransom, ask for the ransom money, but the private key they will provide. They ask for money, maybe they ask for a lot of parties be involved, but they will give you also the name of the organization. And after you bought the private key, you approach the organization and say that we are not the attackers, but we could help with the decryption. That's the latest business model that we have seen in terms of ransomware. Okay, so you may not be able to, do the action in terms of trying to catch them because there will be no trace for the one that offer you help, and somehow they still get to make money by selling the private key for the ransomware that the real attacker have done. Okay, so there's a lot of involvement. But in order to do the protection, it's not sexy at all. You have to do the risk analysis, provide protection, and keep a lookout because right now that's the state that we are in. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Edmund. And I find some interesting similarities, right? So what Philip said about, you need senior levels of attention to address that. You mentioned quite clearly a series of techniques, and ransomware is a business model. Right? It's a business model the attacker used to achieve certain incentives and certain gains, right? And we will discuss a bit later what really can we do to break this business model or to make it such that the incentives do not favor continuing this operation. But Stephen, we're interested to hear what's Interpol's thoughts on this and any insights you might have. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Singapore again. Right. It's been said this is a quite remarkable event that we're very grateful for being here. So my role as Executive Director of Police Services is an unusual one. I'm responsible for all matters around terrorism, financial crime, cyber crime, organised and emerging crime, including mafia, crimes against children, global outreach and analysis. And in my spare time, I haven't got any. But it's a fascinating role, and there are 2 points that I think, as we look at Interpol, that it's one of the most famous brands in law enforcement, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. We do not have powers of arrest. Tom Cruise does not work for me. But what we have is sometimes much more powerful. It's the ability to connect. And it's something that, as a very experienced detective going through the ranks in the UK at Scotland Yard, I've suddenly been able to see the way that threats emerge across the globe. And that's a privilege that means when I'm here, we have to work together to say, whether you're the head of the NCA for the UK, head of any of the agencies in this room, you by nature see the perspective from your country. Right. And whether it's crimes against children, cybercrime, financial crime, what we are seeing is global manifestations, different areas of victims, different areas of offenders, different areas of where the evidence sits. And what we see is that law enforcement has to understand in this day and age now, we are not the first responders. So in everything that we deal with here, my early career, if you were first on scene, You know, you would be the knight in shining armor, you would save the victim, you would secure the scene, you would arrest the bad guy, you'd interview them, and everything was wonderful.
Right.
Crime has changed. And what we now see is law enforcement has to understand that when one of these ransomware attacks is taking place, it's the equivalent of seeing somebody in the street that's been stabbed. You step back and you allow the paramedics to save the life of the victim. You don't start investigating and asking them questions as they lay there in an awful situation. And we now have to understand that we stand back. We allow the experts in this room to secure the life or the lifeblood of the organisations or sectors that are involved. So that's very important. And what we now need to look at is a maturing model. I had the real privilege with going downstairs with you and looking at some of the fantastic technologies that exist. But what we're seeing at the moment is the emphasis on disruption is an important one. But there is a very low risk for the offenders who are engaged in this area of crime. They might get disrupted, they'll move on to the next. The likelihood of them having their crypto assets seized, of being arrested, a knock on the door, whatever it might be, is too low. So as we save the victims, we now need to start working together to say, what is the evidential package that needs to be developed and shared through Interpol if necessary, because these are global events. The second part of what I've seen being at Interpol is we have to go forward together. There's no, I respect Singapore immensely for its vision, its use of technology, its sense of community. But of course, if we don't bring the countries in Africa where cyber threats are emerging, at least to some degree with us, the criminals will emerge and continue to adapt in other locations. So the national models will get us so far. But the concept that we heard this morning about, is multilateral dead? Absolutely not. If you could design Interpol today in the digital age, you would do so. And then if we can just understand how we start to do some cases, we can talk about them later, but we need to understand that this is a truly global threat. The capacity in various parts of Africa, South America and Asia need to be brought forward together. We have a tool to do it. And then my final point is those amazing tools downstairs. Interpol has not just this unique view of the world in terms of the crimes, it's also got an opportunity to be a conduit for some of those technologies and insights that we've seen, those threat vectors that are emerging. The idea that we have 35, 40 poor countries trying to either give up on having those insights or trying to buy them independently is madness. What we need to be able to do is say, how can Interpol support a global model that provides countries these insights so that they can stand on their own 2 feet and we can develop sustainable economies, sustainable communities, and have a safer world all round. So I've got a big vision, but I think it's worth it.
Interesting. Thank you, Stephen. I mean, the bigger question is cyber a global public good? Right? Where there's a global consensus to support countries and organizations that cannot necessarily afford, but for the greater good. Is cyber a global public good? Interesting. Scott, your turn.
Yeah. Well, I have an answer for that, which is we have no boundaries, right? So this is transnational. I mean, this is for civilized society, really. So Scott Morgan, the Chief Legal Officer at Splunk, I also look after government affairs and our global impact work. And Splunk is a US-based technology company. And we really are trying to empower our customers and organizations to leverage their data and to find operational resilience. And what that means for us is if something in your vast digital landscape, and we all have it, whether we have it proprietarily in our own organizations or we're using it as part of society, something happens. What is that event? Is that a server that's out? Is that an application that's not performing? Is it a cyber event? Is it some combination? And that's what we really try and do. So naturally, we think of this as cybersecurity as a data problem. And we really think the more data that you can collate and you can look at and you can share, which goes a lot to the public policy issues that we're going to be talking about, will be critically important. And one thing that I just want to pick up on, and I'll turn it back to you because I know we're going to want to get to questions, this idea of a public-private partnership, and I think both Stephen and Philip touched on it, which is critical infrastructure is not in the hands of government, and that's a shift. Law enforcement, government is reliant on the private sector. And so when a ransomware or a cyber attack happens, it's an attack on potentially a sovereign nation that can shut it down, but it's not within the government's control at that point. So that relationship just fundamentally has to change, and that's what we're driving toward in our public policy work. So, but greatly appreciate you pulling together this forum, to the CSA and to the panel and to all of you. So look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Scott. And just a quick question from an enterprise perspective. How do you think an enterprise, I mean, what's the good or bad from your experience, what has been the good or bad in the way enterprises have tried to address a ransomware when they have to deal with an incident?
Yeah, in my role, I think a lot about governance and what we can control. We try and influence policy, and we have these discussions. We show up at these events, and we share, and we learn best practices, and hopefully we collectively move forward together. But within each organization, I also think we all have a responsibility to really harden our organizations and move from defensive to maybe something that's not as passive. Maybe it's a little bit more offensive. So when I think about our organization, I think about how do we elevate cybersecurity within our company? And obviously, we custody our employees' data, we custody our customers' data. Hopefully some of you are customers, and so your customers' data is with us. So it's really critically important to us, and we are a cybersecurity company. So as we thought about it, we were having that discussion at the board level through our audit committee. And we have three, like most US public companies, we have three standing committees. We, a couple of years ago, established a cybersecurity and data responsibility committee, which we thought that was an important element of the cyber committee, which elevated it so we could have an independent discussion with our board members, and we could elevate it within our employee base. We could send a message. We can get a lot of executive time focused on it. And in doing so, it was very interesting, a couple of practical points. Enterprise risk management sits with the audit committee, and historically, like with most companies, cyber sat with the audit committee. It's a very natural fit. But the audit committee is very busy, particularly if you're a public company. And so breaking this out, but had the risk of disaggregating and disassociating enterprise risk on the one hand, and cyber, which is such a key element of enterprise risk, on the other hand. So we did a couple things. We have a director who serves on both committees, and she is the one who ensures continuity there. We have the Office of the Corporate Secretary, which is within the group that I lead. We ensure that we're looking at every agenda and the materials of each of those discussions to ensure if there is a cyber issue that touches on enterprise risk, we'll make sure that and management may duplicate their efforts, but that's okay. We want to make sure it gets in front of both those committees, and same on the internal audit side if it's going from audit to cyber. And then finally, we once a year get those committees together, which most often actually takes place at the board level. So we have that robust discussion, we bring those back together.
Thanks, Scott. Again, re-emphasizing the point that executive attention really matters, right? So let's come a couple of questions before we take some of the questions from the audience. So Philip, Eamon, I have a couple of questions. You guys are in government or have been in government, and what's the one thing that you really need to do in government? If you say, look, there's one thing that you really can do, either from a legal perspective, from an operational capability perspective, what's the one thing that can be done to truly, or if that's even possible, change the game in the ransomware landscape? Right.
Well, I think one thing that needs to be done is education. But when I talk about education, it's not just about the cyber workforce or the IT. It must be done at all levels. Right. And it has to start from the top. You have to educate the boss first, because it's always the case for many of the workshops that we have organized in Thailand, that people will raise their hand that everyone here know how important it is, but the one with the checkbook doesn't understand it. Okay, so that's what to be communicated from level of the top to understand the risk management process. Risk is not a bad thing, but you have to manage it, because risk bring in opportunity, risk bring in the chance for you to get more profit. But how can you select the risk management model that is applicable to you? And when you educate the people, also you have to educate your staff or user as well. And one other important thing that we have to educate them is that for ransomware case, it's not the IT issues. is the organization issues. Everyone can be the lead target. Everyone can bring in the ransomware or malware. So everyone have to be the defender. Okay, the second question that we will get into later. So in this case of ransomware, everyone has to be the cyber defender. Okay, in order to raise the level of awareness that we need. That's something I would like to change, to educate at all levels.
Thank you. Education. And the one with the checkbooks, often the one not so educated. Philip.
I think I think about this, I put on my Pentagon hat and I think about it from, and we're talking about ransomware here today, I think about it through the Ransomware Task Force perspective. You have to actually stop and think about what's your objective. Right? What are you actually having as your core outcome that you're working toward? And you have to think about prioritization, right? So at the core of it, when we hark back to when ransomware wasn't such a priority for the US government, it was because they had lots of other things they needed to be focused on, right? So when it comes to ransomware, you have to actually juxtapose that against a whole range of other things that you're gonna have to put, above and below that. You can't take the Department of Justice and have them solely focus on ransomware, right? But they have to be in the lead. So from our perspective, one of the things that we set out as one of the core elements of this, and I think this goes for the private sector as well, is you need to actually prioritize it. That this is something that's going to have to be put at the forefront of the agenda, because at the end of the day, and I mean this wholeheartedly, the criminals understand how to take advantage of bureaucratic failure. They look at governments and they think about how to arbitrage the gaps between departments and agencies. And so in the United States context, I think one of the things that we argued so vehemently was that this isn't a law enforcement problem only. This is a national security threat. What does that mean in terms of resource allocation? It means a lot. Because at the end of the day, if you only have law enforcement focusing on the problem, that means you're not bringing other intelligence collection assets. That means you're not bringing a whole lot of other resources to bear on the problem. And so from a government perspective, if you're going to prioritize something like ransomware as a national security threat, you just change the entire calculus of what then goes against it in terms of your objectives. So from our perspective, it was, you need to prioritize this. It rises to the level. This isn't just a nuisance. This isn't just an economic problem. It's something that you have to change the way that you organize all of your departments and agencies in order to affect.
Was it difficult in the US to convince senior people about the risk and the threat of ransomware?
I think the conversation had been ongoing for a number of years, and the answer was, no, this does not rise to the level. This is, in some regards, I think the answer was, this is something that industry needs to figure out. Why should we have to come to the rescue of a company that can't protect itself?
What was the turning point?
So we just so happened to be writing the Ransomware Task Force report right when Colonial Pipeline happened.
I see.
And so what you saw was kind of this confluence of events. This was not long after the Irish healthcare system had been hit. This was just before another huge attack against critical infrastructure in the United States happened. And it was really this confluence of events that made folks realize, oh, okay, yeah, this is something we have to take much more seriously. It has broad economic ramifications, but this is a bigger problem. When you're talking about critical infrastructure, when you're talking about where could this go next, who are the actors that are actually involved that are doing this, that was the game changer, at least in the US context.
Interesting. So
Yep.
the incident drove the awareness, right? Stephen, just very quickly, I mean, you've seen it from a sort of global perspective. Are there best practices you'd say, hey, for everyone here, these are some of the best practices I've seen that really everyone should begin to think about?
Yes, there are. I mean, the model that we have here in Singapore is just remarkable. And I'm not saying that because I'm here. You see the way that you organize the law enforcement, the certs, the technology industry. There is a genuine ecosystem. Right. I think what we see is these pockets of innovation, these ideas, this good practice. And what we want to be able to do is to share them at pace. You know, Interpol has 195 member countries, and I sometimes say our greatest strength is that we have 195 countries. And of course, as we heard this morning, in a period of conflict and tension, Our greatest challenge is that we have 195 countries. But it makes it very easy for us to reach out around some of this basic good practice. You know, we need to operate as Interpol below state-sponsored. That is very clear. You know, we are a neutral organisation. But we've seen initiatives, and what the best practice is sometimes the vision. Places like Singapore, the UK has got a really interesting understanding that what I was talking about earlier, where we keep ourselves safe. These are concentric circles of safety that we build, not just within the country. So we have established an African cyber desk with the funding from the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. That desk is responsible for not just delivering operations from people here in the room or other law enforcement. We're training local people in country in the skills that they need, and then they deliver the operations. But that is a model that we have to replicate across the world. So we have to build that good practice, and then we share it quickly. You know, we have confidential platforms where you can either share just good practice, the Cyber Knowledge Exchange, available to 195 countries, available to every partner in this room. You see good practice and you want to share it with law enforcement, we can put it on there very quickly and get it out. We also have the CCP, which is the operational platform, which we hold just for sensitive data. But again, we've moved forward. This is no longer about law enforcement data. It's about partnership data that can quickly bring together an operation, sometimes identify potential victims before they've actually been attacked, and identify and support them with the private sector. So I think actually what we recognise now is a lot of the best practice in terms of threat identification and those data insights is with the private sector. So how do we then use, again, this system that's already been established across 195 countries to share quickly? But I think it's our job to use these platforms wisely, to make sure that the analysis we do, because again, what we see is when there is a global cyber threat, they're not really global. They do impact on the regions of the world differently. So when we do the threat assessments for member countries to try and understand, we share that good practice around what are the threats, how can they identify and deal with them more quickly. And some of the good practice is about getting leadership. What we struggle with is the thing that the sort of the elephant in the room is the under-reporting of the issue that we're talking about here. Because you do not wish to report often that you've been subject to a ransomware attack. You don't want to reveal how much harm it has done to you, and you certainly don't want to reveal, and we wouldn't want to reveal how we've used partners to minimise the harm and help a company or an individual recover. But I think that reporting, we need some brave organisations to step forward and talk about the good practice that's hidden behind the scenes, but that we can share more effectively with those. We were recently intervened in an attack on a significant regional body in Africa. They didn't know where to turn, and ironically, with all the skill in this room, they turned to us. But then what we did is Group IB helped us go and visit them, and it was a sophisticated attack. And through patience, through working with them and their partners in the region, and with private partners, we're able to help them recover, not just for them, but build a stronger business model for the future. But we then need to share the lessons from that quickly, so that the next victim doesn't have to go through the same pain.
Thank you. Shane, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, any best practices, any sort of ideas, technologies you reckon?
Yeah, so I think the main sort of like protection in some ways against ransomware is actually sort of modernization and actually good IT practices. It's not necessarily the responses, right? It's this whole sort of ecosystem is really monetizing insecurity. They're able to sort of find the weaknesses and then exploit it. So really, like, I think the real approach is that, you know, mitigating the damage, all the good stuff of IT has really become real, right? So the ransomware actor is going to get that foothold, they're going to get that presence. You're never going to keep them off every single machine on your network. But when they get on that one individual machine, how much damage can they do? How much data can they have? And that is where, like, the payoff of some of these technologies that we and others have been pushing of, like, if your system is secure by default, then, you know, and you're on some, you know, on something like a Chromebook, which has never had ransomware, that it can be like re-imaged. There's the ability to immediately recover there, and you're limiting the damage. Similarly, as you sort of move to sort of a zero trust architecture where you have a network where getting one foothold doesn't mean you have access to all of the data and can either steal or encrypt it, but every connection is validated, every connection is encrypted, and you have least privilege, then again, the damage is really mitigated. So across the board, the more we move to this modernized ecosystem, the more you build on secure systems, the more you have your backups and reliability in the cloud, and you are securing your endpoints and making sure you have the zero trust architecture, then it actually means that this damage is mitigated. It's sort of like before we had like, fire standards or standards for ships, like, the Titanic, when it like hit an iceberg, the whole ship sunk. And then now there's, lifeboats, now there is sort of like the compartments can be sealed and you can like mitigate the damage. And I think that's what we need to build our networks, because we'll never make these threat actors go away. But what we can do is make it so these attacks are recoverable, they're able to be mitigated, and the data stolen is smaller, not the entire network's organization's data from just every one tiny breach. And I think that is the mechanism we work towards, and I think where we want to drive others towards in the future as well.
I'll just add one piece on this. So through the ransomware task force process, one of the things that we heard from governments, that we heard from municipalities, that we heard from companies was that there was too much information about what they needed to do. There was all these plans and frameworks and documents, and they didn't know what to do with all of it. And so one of the things that we did, working with folks like Google and with others, was to whittle that down into a very small set of controls that, if deployed, will actually help protect your organization from ransomware specifically. And that's actually something that we've made publicly available. So to try to cut through all that noise and make very clearly, here are the 40 controls that if you deploy them, you're actually in a much better place.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Scott, just a quick one. How do you get your executives interested in cyber?
Our executives are,
That's right.
it was our business. So I think we're pretty interested.
You mean apart from getting a major hack, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You want to get them interested before the major incident, not after the major incident.
So I think it's a good opportunity. I see the rise of the CISO, or CSO, whatever that person, whoever that person is in your organization, as super, super critical. And I think putting this board committee was part of that. It really elevated this role. I think where a lot of companies are going, and I assume governments will follow at some point, is to really integrate security. So historically, security was siloed, and each group had a responsibility for it, much like the government. And I think with this multilateralism is sort of taking place at the meta level, at the government level, but it also needs to take place at the organizational level within everyone's organization. And so we see this, our journey has been, you have a CISO who really looks after your IT assets and your perimeter. And then maybe you have a cloud service, which we do, so they look after the cloud service. What they historically have not done, I think forward-looking organizations have done this, and more are, is actually they actually own product security, that's security by design. And they have the budget to push it, even if it's in a different group. And that's that cross-function. I mean, this morning we heard trust, we heard inclusivity, we heard interoperability. Those words don't typically go together. They don't fall into any one neat functional category, which says this is a super cross-functional, super multidisciplinary problem. And so if we can think that way, that's where our heads are.
Great. I'm just cognizant of time. We can take one question from the audience. If you have, you can raise your hand. If not, then just pick one from Slido. Any? Okay, now just pick one question from here. So there's a question here. It says, is the current set of skills of the cyber defender sufficient to handle the non-technical aspect of ransomware operations, such as negotiation? Right? Clearly, the questioner is asking, are there other skills that cyber people need to have other than just really solid technical skills in order to address a ransomware situation? Anyone wants to take the question? Go for it.
Okay. Based on the experience that we do incident response case, at least for Thailand, the first thing that we need to have is empathy, which is quite lacking for cyber people because you have to deal with the victim organization. And especially, I don't know if there are any other country, but in Thailand, we start the blaming game early. Yeah. So who to blame? So at first we have to focus on listening and try to have empathy for the victim organization and try to convey them that even though we cannot recover the data, we cannot decrypt the data for you, but there's many more tasks that we need to ensure that they don't come back. So even though you might have a backup, but still if you couldn't find which way that the attacker came from and provide better protection, within 90 days they're going to come back. So that's a skill that we need to have the empathy to listen and also try to solve the problem from their perspective and to move that perspective of the victim organization into the better organization that have better preventive measure so that it doesn't happen again.
Thank you. Stephen, yes.
So I think it's a really important question, and we have to protect ourselves from the scourge of reinvention, because when we look at these challenges, there is a global architecture, and through partners like Google, Big View, sometimes Interpol and others, we need to map where our use of data, where our communications, where our threat management is working well. And then if it is working well, we need to reinforce it, not overcomplicate the architecture that exists within the global law enforcement environment. If we can simplify it and we can go and do something once and do it simply, whether that's the best piece of investigative analysis, whether it's threat analysis, whether it's threat identification, it doesn't matter. But then we need to disseminate that as quickly as we can. And I think that the next part of this is what we see from an Interpol perspective is ransomware is not just about individuals trying to get rich through this ruthless crime. It is being used to support other crime types, including terrorism. We've seen Al-Shabaab and others using ransomware to develop their model. And what we haven't discussed here is how do we go after the assets? A lot of this is crypto assets. We need to work together, again, to go after them hard. There needs to be a consequence. We get those assets either back to the victims if we can identify the victims, or we share it amongst those organisations, the NGOs that are dealing with the victims. It doesn't matter who it is. But we need to have this strategic view and stop putting self-interest above international safety.
Brilliant. Yes, you have to stop the business model. We have 3 minutes. I'll just ask every sort of panelist here, for 30 seconds, what's the one thing you feel that you want to leave the audience behind? What's one insight? Scott, we'll start with you.
Yeah, this isn't fate. It may get worse, it may not. That's up to us. It truly is with, I think, a lot of the discussions that we've had. We do have to reduce the financial incentive. It's really critical. But we need to think about this problem very differently. It's not a technical problem. It's a technical problem plus plus.
Thank you. Philip.
Yeah, I'll just pivot off of Scott's comment. I mean, it's not fate if you can plan ahead, right? At the end of the day, you should just expect that they're going to come for you, whether you're a government or a municipality or a company. So take those basic steps and disrupt their business model by making it harder for them to do it. They don't want to have to put the energy and resources into attacking you. So don't make it easy for them, right? Raise the bar just ever so little bit and they'll step away and look for an easier target.
Great.
Yeah, and very similar. It's like, I think there's a real risk in moving towards learned helplessness here and learning to a mechanism that we think this is inevitable. Like there is a business model here. It's so great to see such a broad range of people that I think thinking about the business model, thinking about the law enforcement, thinking about the technical controls, thinking about the architecture, all of those combined, I think, can make this a lot less feasible. And then we can, it's always an equilibrium, crime won't go away, but we can shift this equilibrium that it is a lot harder and they will make a lot less money and we will lose a lot less money and it will be a much better world if we all work together.
Thank you. Stephen?
Really nicely put. If in the cyber-driven age we could have a vision where we would suddenly be able to create a law enforcement organisation that spanned 195 countries, we couldn't create it. In today's day and age, we cannot recreate what we have. So all of us, not just law enforcement, governments, tech sector, we all need to think, how do we leverage the best we can out of multilateral organisations like Interpol? And for me, a lot of that is you have got some amazing capacity building capabilities. We have a global academy that we can share with member countries very quickly. Let's make sure those countries that are struggling to keep up are given some sense of identity, some sense of self-worth and self-determination. And if we do that, we can help accelerate some of the benefits in those countries too.
Absolutely. Stammen, you have the last word.
3 words. The first, if you are still using the username and password only to authentication, stop. Okay? At least you need the MFA, but if you have any budget left, you have to move on to Zero Trust. Because otherwise, it's just a disaster waiting to happen. I've seen it so many times. It's always the same nightmare, not fairy tale, because it starts off with some username, password to authenticate for everything, and then it's end up with ransomware. And the second one is that you need to invest or take a look at air gap backup, because we have seen many organizations that do 3 backups, but they all got destroyed and encrypted because it's all the same network. So you need to have air gap backup. And if you worry about data breach, about personal data, your client leak, you have to take a look at privacy enhanced technology. That's 3 words I need to convey here to prevent it, or at least reduce the effect of ransomware.
Thank you. I thought today was a very rich conversation, even though we didn't have much time. I hope the audience enjoyed as much as myself. Could we just give a round of applause to the panelists, please?
Thank you, and a big round of applause too for our moderator for this segment. Let's give it up for Charles. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, dear panelists. Please proceed off stage and be seated. Thank you so much for your highly engaging segment. Not only was it, engaging, it was also lighthearted somehow for a very heavy topic like this. Thank you so much for your contribution, and also to all our audience here, thank you so much for your questions. And for those of you who want to rewatch this segment again, it's available online at our SICW website, so you may rewatch this session at your convenience. And also for tomorrow, we have the AI revolution reshaping cybersecurity in the era of generative AI. If this topic is extremely intriguing for you, we'd love to see you back in this studio at 2 p.m. My name is Charlene. Thank you for joining us today the entire day, and we shall see you tomorrow. Thank you. Goodbye.